Thank you for joining us for global discussion on value and asset management. My name is Mike Bordenaro. I'm the Executive Director of the Asset Leadership Network, and we're very happy to have Peter Kohler and Sally Nugent from Asset Management Reflections, and Jack Kelly-Allen, Senior Fellow, also joining us today. But before we get started, I'd like to thank our organizational members, our patron members, and our organizational members, which includes a new member, Trent Port Services. We'll be talking about them in the near future. So this web program is an offshoot from the Value and Benefits from Asset Management web series that we started with Sally and Peter and the Asset Management Council to showcase asset management accomplishments and provide a structured framework for discussion of value and benefits. We are establishing a database based on all of the presentations. We have 2 presentations, one from Australia or somewhere else in the country, one from US or somewhere else in the world. And we're building up quite a database of comments of organizations that are saying what the specific values and benefits are. So that's really good. But we want to talk about value and benefits from our perspectives and open up the discussion for others to join in. And we start with stakeholders. So, but before that, we were exploring the value and the importance of asset management fundamentals. And now we start with stakeholders, are the people who are interested in the value being delivered by the organization. A person or organization that can affect or be affected by or perceive themselves affected by a decision or an activity. And the great thing about the ISO 55001 is that it requires you to involve these stakeholders who are important to your ongoing assessment. And engaging them creates additional value. It's harder work. It takes more to ask people their opinions and what is good for them. But over and over, we're finding that stakeholder involvement is a great value to add. And now we're going to switch over to Peter Kohler. Peter?
Yeah, hi everyone. You can probably tell by my accent that I am not from Chicago. In fact, I am talking right now from Sydney, Australia. And thank you for allowing me, ALN, and allowing me to participate in this forum. I look forward to doing that. I participated in a number of forums of the Asset Leadership Network, so I do like doing this, and so thank you for another opportunity. Word value and values. The English language is what it is. I'm led to believe, I'm not a linguist, but I'm led to believe that it is a very difficult language. And one of the reasons, you can either call it difficult or very rich, I guess, depending on your perspective. And I suspect that part of the reason that the word value and values is constantly talked about within the asset management community is because of that very reason. There's a number of reasons why we want to talk about value, but the word value itself has some interesting nuances that we all need to be aware of when we use the word value. The words value and values, I think we're all well aware, most of us will be well aware, that the word can mean different things in very, very different contexts. The word value itself can be used as a noun, a verb, and an adjective. Next slide, please, Nick. There are some illustrations here of it being used as a noun. You can talk about what is the value of doing something, or as a verb, how do we value something? Next slide, please, Nick. Some interesting definitions here around the word value. The significance of this slide perhaps is not so much in the definitions, but to highlight to you that the word value, whilst it can be used as a verb or a noun, as we just talked about, the word value and values, whilst they sound familiar or similar value and values, they're not quite the same thing. So when we use the word value in an ISO standard or in everyday speech, we need to be aware of the context we're going to use the word, and we need to be sure that what we're talking about is the nuance of the application of the word value is correct. As it's highlighted on this particular slide here, when you talk about the value, you could be talking about the worth or utility, or the utility delivered to an organization. But when you use the word values, you're now talking about the principles or standards that may guide or shape someone's behavior, may guide and shape in this case, the asset management system. And so when we use the word value and we write the word value and we talk and we use the word verbally, and when we write the word, we need to be aware of those nuances. Those nuances do add color to our language, but and that's often useful. But that utility also comes with a risk, and that is we need to be aware of how to use those words and in which context to use those words and what those words mean. Next slide, please, Nick. The reason for putting these definitions up is not to talk about the definitions per se, but to talk about when we talk about the asset management fundamentals or the asset management principles. They're probably going to be talked about. The name of them is probably going to change in the new version of ISO 55000. It's important for us to understand not just what these words mean, but how they combine and where do they come from. One of the more interesting aspects that I think, and I was involved in putting together the original ISO standard, ISO 55000, the original standard, if I can use that phrase now, the 2014 version. One of the things we didn't really address well, and I've always seen it as a bit of an error in the way we put together the 55,000 in those days, is that these principles or fundamentals, whichever name you want to call them, they don't just arrive out of thin air. They actually do come from understanding stakeholder requirements, or as I like to call it, they're a synthesis of stakeholder requirements, a synthesis or a distillation of stakeholder requirements. So when we talk about these fundamentals and principles, including value, we need to realize that where these come from, and so that it behoves us to think about stakeholder requirements. Essentially, if these fundamentals come from a synthesis of stakeholder requirements, we must continue to look at and talk to stakeholders to understand the range of and the application of these fundamentals. Next slide, please, Nick. If that's the case, then if these fundamentals are a synthesis or a distillation of stakeholder requirements, one imagines then that they become key requirements for your management system. If we're indeed to deliver the value, I'm using the word deliberately in this way. If we're keen to deliver value to our stakeholders, one of the things we need to assure ourselves is that the principles, the fundamentals, get implemented within our asset management system, because that's the way we can trace back to our stakeholders, trace back that we've delivered what the stakeholders have required. Next presentation, Sally.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to the ALN for hosting this session. I've just got a few points I wanted to make around value in terms of how you might measure it and how important that can be. And so I put this first slide up. Mike has already talked about stakeholders, and so I wanted to put forward some concepts on the kind of value that stakeholders may view, and these are just a few of the possibilities in it. So shareholders and also organizational owners, they're looking for price and dividends. They may be looking for ethics, and they'll also be looking for long-term investment, retirement fund outcomes, depending on their perspective. Customers and the community, on the other hand, would be looking for goods and service. They may be looking for protection of the environment, a whole range there. And employees, salary, respect, status. And you can keep going. I mean, the number of stakeholders is huge. Tax departments in countries looking for revenue to run the country. So there are many stakeholders in any organization, all looking for some form of value. But next slide, please, Nick. How is that value measured, if you like? And I put up a post on LinkedIn a few days ago, and this is the result from that. And the question there you can see, is money the measure for all value delivered by assets? And of the 40 to 50 people who actually answered, you can see a resounding number of them said no, and had one person say yes and one person say perhaps. And there was a very strong sort of reaction from the asset management community with whom I'm mostly linked on LinkedIn, to say no, money isn't the measure for all value delivered by assets. I asked this question because when I first started my career, I was sharing an office. I was green as anything, fresh out of university, and I was sharing an office with a professor from RMIT, Noel Herbst. And he turned to me one day, I'm freshly minted on the job, and he says to me, everything can be measured in dollars, everything. And I'm saying, no, that's not true. That was my instinctive reaction. I mean, you think about how people go to huge lengths to save a life or to rescue someone. You know, there are many other ways that you value things. There's all this little question nagging at the back of my mind. And I've always had that question or his comment sitting in the back of my mind. And I wanted to make the comment that dollars are an understood measure of value across the community. And I'm going to cite two areas of that prove this. The actuarial tables and the insurance industry have the value of a person, you know, woman, man, child, and what age they are for all their business investment and insurance purposes. And then you come across something which was called the reasonable man test. Now, reasonable man is a legal precedent. You can find lots of material, but I have seen it used. One of the Asset Management Council members, Peter Buckland, put forward a paper quite some years ago, or at least a decade, if not longer, which talked about how you could use a reasonable man test to work out whether something was worth investing in. And the example he gave was of a local council that wanted to build a footbridge over a river. And he posited or put forward the proposal that if you could drill down the cost per household to the community, and you could also drill down the benefit gained from the footbridge to something that made sense to each individual within that community, then they would be able to make a decision as to whether they wanted to support the bridge. And it went down to, you know, you would save 10 miles a day in a week in walking. And okay, that's hard to assess. But it drilled all the way down to, on a daily basis, you'd save 10 minutes every day. And was this worth $500 of a household's investment? So that it would be then easy for an organisation to say yes or no. And given that boards and CEOs and all of us, in fact, need to be able to make decisions as to whether something that we value is worth investing in, maintaining, or whatever, is it not potentially reasonable to have some way of having a common denominator? Because if you can't measure, you can't easily manage and decide to invest. So are we perhaps being a little too technical engineering to say that no, money isn't a method? I suppose maybe the question's phrased badly on this one. Money isn't, we shouldn't be saying no, money isn't a measure for value delivered by assets. Maybe we should be saying that we can use money as a common denominator to explain the value of things. So, I mean, how are boards going to make decisions on what they should invest in terms of the triple bottom line, for example, if they can't say, well, that's going to deliver, it's going to cost us this much, but it's going to deliver this equivalent value or more from or to the community. You've got to have a way of assessing and measuring the outcome. Anyway, they're just questions. As usual, I don't have answers. I mostly have questions. And thank you for listening. And it's now time to hand on to Jack.
Well, thank you, Sally. You and Peter are and Mike are a hard act to follow. So first of all, I want to talk about value from the way that ISO is currently thinking about it in the way that the ISO 55000 is being redeveloped. It's, as Peter sort of indicated, it was one of the first 4 fundamentals of the current ISO 55000. And there are now 7 principles in which value is still one of them. It's so interesting to me as a fairly new person to the whole conversation about standards, that, you know, there's so many different perspectives on value and everything else, frankly, in the ISO 55000 rewrite. But some of the specifics that still have not been settled are the role of stakeholders, the relationship of value to organizational objectives, and whether you should take a look at a broad look at value or a more narrow definition of value. So the next slide, please. So several people wanted to make sure that you and the audience were well aware that what I'm about to say is my own personal view. This is basically endorsed by nobody but me. And so here it is. And I will also have to say that my own view of value is evolving. Every morning when I get up and I'm in the shower and I think about, I'm thinking about the subject of value, I think new thoughts, because it's a complex subject, and it's a subject that I think it's not simple. The first thing, and Peter sort of mentioned this, is that value is based on perceptions. And what we need to understand about perceptions is perceptions are personal. So when I look at something and I assess the value of that thing, my assessment is likely to be different from your assessment or other people's assessments. But one of the things, and kind of one of the terms that's popular these days that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is the term looking at things through different lenses. And so a lot of people instinctively look at value from a personal lens, an individual lens. And that's all fine and good. But when we talk about asset management, we're talking about value perceived through an organizational lens. And that's a very different thing. So from an organization perspective, value is based on, at least one of the ways I think about it, is value is in the simplest terms, is whatever the organizational is held accountable for. So if your organization is held accountable for stakeholder value, or your organization is held accountable for customer service, or your organization is held accountable for, revenue or perceived value in its business line, that's important. Now, as I hear myself saying this, what I realize is that those perceptions of value differ by stakeholder. But at the end of the day, in terms of what organizational success is based on, it's based on whichever of those stakeholder values drive what the organizational values are. And organizational values are usually set by boards of directors and senior management. The stakeholders that are used in coming up with those perceived values could be employees, it could be shareholders, it could be the public at large, it could be whatever the organizational is able to perceive as being important. and not all organizations perceive the same things in the same ways. So it's definitely more than just dollars, although to Sally's point, I have to acknowledge the fact that in the ISO discussions, there are a couple of people who basically talk about the dollar value of assets, and that's what they think of as most important. And bless their hearts, they're certainly entitled to that perspective. And one could reasonably argue that all of the other stakeholder perceptions and all of the other stakeholder senses of value translate into dollar-based bottom lines for the organization. I'm not here to argue that point. I'm just want to share that perspective. So that's one whole set of thoughts. The other thought that I had very recently is that when we talk about value, let me back up. Organizations perceive reality generally not as a continuous, like, streaming experience. It's more like the earliest days of movies, where basically you've strung together a series of photographs. And so what you see is, in the very earliest version of movies, is you see a bunch of still photographs strung together in a series of snapshots. And in a lot of ways, that's the way organizations perceive reality. You do a strategic plan, and in that strategic plan, you reach out to various stakeholders and you get their perception on what's important. What are the objectives they care about? How do they want you to perform against those objectives? So that's a snapshot. And that's put in a strategic plan, and then that's communicated out through the organization to all the different people who have to execute what the organization does to achieve those outcomes. And then they report back periodically on how they've done. So senior management gets a series of freeze frame snapshots on how the organization is performing, and then they react to that. And so it's not, when we talk about one of the things that Sally and Peter and Mike and I have talked about in other contexts is a new principle called adaptability, which basically says you need to perceive this stuff on a more real-time basis. So instead of just taking a series of snapshots, you need to have a streaming experience that says, oops, things have changed. We need to react in some reasonable time period to those changes. That's a whole different conversation. But with respect to value can get into the conversation in that same way. In other words, people at different points in the organization can say, hey, the customers are seeing value in a way that we hadn't thought about before. We need to reconsider that. And so the ability of organizations to feed different value perceptions back into their decision-making processes can be really, really important, which kind of reinforces one of the things Peter said, which is all of these things have to fit together for an organization to be effective. So with that, I think I'm going to be quiet and go from there.
We'll let Peter share the takeaways, and then we can discuss. I look forward to talking about these items. Peter?
Yes, I'm here.
Would you like to go over the stakeholders or the takeaways?
Oh, the takeaways. Well, happy to. Yes, following on from that discussion from all the sources, perhaps a number of takeaways, and perhaps this also might lead into the discussion as well, whether you agree or disagree with the takeaways. The first takeaway is about knowing your stakeholders and their requirements. I would argue personally, I would argue it's more about knowing. It's about knowing and agreeing with your stakeholders, their requirements, being aware of the needed fundamentals. I think I made the pitch there that these fundamentals arrive from a distillation of stakeholder requirements. So I think being continually aware of those is fundamentally important. Interesting. English language is wonderful, isn't it? You can use the word fundamental as a noun, as an adjective as well. Probably explains why, as I said to you, it's such a difficult language to master, I think. The third dot point there is be attuned to variations in the environment around you. I think Jack spoke to that. The notion of adaptability is very much about that, being able to sense and respond. And indeed, the notion of an organization that's able to sense and respond to change almost means that it's an open system, and the management system is open rather than closed. And perhaps we can have a quick conversation about that as well in the context of value. We always seek to identify what is missing. Yes, we should never sit on our backside and think that we know everything. We should always be aware that there's much we don't know, and we should seek to know what we don't know, which is not an easy thing to do, but that really does mean we keep an open mind on things and talk to other people, get different views. It's fundamentally important, I think, when we talk about values, we talk about stakeholders and values. That it's it's very easy for example, a whole bunch of engineers would look at things and come up with their ideas. That would be one slice of one frequency within the whole frequency of white light. But what we really want is people that can see the white, not the particular color yellow. And so in order to identify what is missing, I think it's fundamentally important to have various different views and being able to access those different views. From there on in, we might start the discussion. Back to you, Mike.
Sure. So Sally, do you want to make any comments on that? Nick, actually, we can hold off on this. This is an announcement for at the end of the program. So you can stop sharing the screen now and we'll go into the discussion. Jack, if you want to join us, and know that every time your hand touches your headset, you sound like your cufflinks are rattling. So we heard you, everything was fine, but you just might want to be aware of it. So Sally, did you want to say anything on the takeaways?
No, I was going to go beyond the takeaways.
Well, then go beyond.
Okay. I noticed that one of the participants, Ian, I think it was, said that he was pleased to see the resounding no, and I think that's what a lot of the people who read the poll and answered the poll felt. I did actually, after all that, I had two major thoughts. One was, I wonder how people would have answered that poll from a different industry sector, like the insurance industry sector, right? Or the financial industry sector. And would we have had a completely different result? And is this yet another example of engineers being there and technical people being their own worst enemy? In the sense that if you're on the board or in senior management, you have to make decisions based on your resources, which translate to dollars. And actually, I like Jack's phrase of translate to dollars. I think perhaps we could rephrase the poll slightly differently and ask it again, because people have to be able to know whether to invest in order to produce a value for a stakeholder, and whether they can afford to invest to produce that value, for example, or how they're going to. So I'm unconvinced that that we're being wise to think that there are intrinsic values that we can't measure. And I know there's danger in drilling it down to a dollar value, but I suspect we need some form of language or communication or measurement around that in order to, in fact, really deal with value appropriately for the whole picture of asset management. I hope I said that clearly.
Yes, you did. And the beauty of the survey is that it was in English and you used the word only. And everyone said no. Everyone except for two people said, no, it is not the only. So if you changed that part, then it would change, but of course it's not the only. And Jack mentioned customer satisfaction. Of course, organizations are measuring customer satisfaction. There are so many measurements that it's not possible for there to be only one measurement that will rule them all. But yes, the translated to dollar values is a good way of helping people understand and assist decision making, which is a big part of the ISO 55000 process, is to improve decision making.
One of the more interesting aspects of all of that is, what's the value of a human life to society, and which is Sally alluded to that when she talked about the insurance industry for life insurance. And that gets a very emotional response from a lot of people. The first reaction is normally negative.
How dare they?
How dare they? That's right. Think I'm only worth 5 million. My gosh. Well, there might be some people here.
Worth that much?
That's what I was going to say. There might be some people here who are worth 20 million, but on average, it's whatever the figure is. Yeah, but it's a for a lot of people a confronting prospect to think about my mother or me or my son or my daughter only worth 5 million, whatever the figure is.
But one of the points there, Peter, is that what you've just mentioned is totally a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
There are some cultures that value individuals a whole lot and other cultures that don't value them at all. So you can't separate value of an individual from the culture in which it's valued. But so another thing about when I think about value, I like to think about companies that we're familiar with. And one of the ones that was one of my personal favorites is Apple, because they're highly successful. They're probably one of the most successful companies on the planet. And when I think about value from as I look as an outsider and a happy user of many Apple products, not all of them, but many of them, I think of value in a number of ways. So for example, they're clearly making money, but it seems to me that their ability to make money is, first of all, to attract a big customer base. And what helps bring that customer base? I think it's simplicity in design, not only simplicity, but beauty in design. I mean, the products that they come out with are just delightful to use. They're simple, they are well designed, and they just give you pleasure when you engage with them. And of course, when they work, sometimes they don't work. But in addition to that, the other big thing, and this is what Tim Cook, the current CEO, what got him his job, was the supply chain. Being able to manage the supply chain to produce the volume of products that they wanted to sell from all the disparate sources from that generated those products. And so that's like a whole other level of engineering excellence, frankly, that kind of creates value. And the value, but you can ultimately, if one way to ultimately process all of that value is, are they making money and what's their share price? And so we're going through kind of a blip right now in terms of share prices. But I think most people would say, at the end of the day, all of those pieces have come together and produced measurable financial value for Apple.
And maybe for the American community as well.
International community, but also value to the designers who are using the products. The tools are being used to enable employment and work and realization of other values and goals. Right. And Kambiz Russell Khani asks, is value realization considered a value for an organization? Now, there's a twist on the English language. So, Peter, why don't we ask?
No, I think that Sally and I were talking about this one the other day, so I'm going to handball this one straight on to Sally. This one.
Okay.
Were we?
Oh yes. Oh yes. Yeah.
A little jog of her memory, Peter. What was?
Yeah,
when we were talking,
we were talking about something slightly different, but I mean, in a sense, the answer is yes, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Simply because if you have a determined value that you want to produce from your organization, then it's only worthwhile if you actually realize that value.
Yeah. And to add to that,
I find it interesting. Before Jack talks, you don't mind if I interrupt, because I was going to ask you, Jack. The issue there is that the notion of value, the value is a fundamental right now. Perhaps the collective of all the fundamentals is value, and the value shouldn't be just a fundamental. That's what this implies. That's what the question here implies, I think.
At the end of the day, let me start at kind of a very simplistic idea of value, and that is, and goes back to what I said earlier. It's what the organization is held accountable for, and it's held accountable by its own management, but it's also held accountable by stakeholders that are understood by the organization as being important. And one of the things that I keep reminding people, including myself, that you have to realize when you talk about an organization's perception of value is organizations perceive value in very different ways and at very different levels of sophistication and understanding. Some organizations have a really simplistic and often incorrect sense of value. It's only the shareholders. It's only, the regulators. When in fact, they may be ignoring some really significant stakeholders like their employees. And then they find themselves with a union being formed and challenging them on a lot of basic, personnel management situation. So organizations are not uniformly sophisticated in understanding the stakeholders they really need to be engaged with and whose value they need to understand and appreciate and incorporate in their organizational planning. So but one of the things I love about ISO 55000 is if you mess it up the first time around and you track how well you've done and you learn the lessons of things you didn't do well and need to do better, then you'll improve it and you'll get better. And so to me, that's one of the most powerful aspects of ISO 55000 and asset management as we think about it through that lens.
Jack,
anyway,
were you saying that if Amazon used ISO 55001, they wouldn't need to have unions?
I'm not saying that they wouldn't need to have unions. I'm saying, and frankly, I don't have any idea whatsoever whether or not Amazon or other highly successful organizations have thought about ISO 55000 and the whole series 55001, or they've just figured out a way to manage things that works for them and is very successful. I don't know the answer to that. One of the things that I realized about ISO 55000 and 55001, the whole asset management suite of standards, is that it's mostly common sense. It's like things people have learned over the years. But the other thing that stuck out to me is not only it's common sense, but it's a very comprehensive set of common sense principles. So there are very few things that are brand new. There are maybe new ways of thinking about things, but it's mostly common sense. And Mike, what you'll recognize, and Peter, this may be of interest to you and Sally, is that many of the organizations in the United States that have adopted asset management in one form or another have done it because it's just common sense to them. And so they've reached out to ISO standards, they've reached out to the IIMM, they've reached out to other work that's been done across the world, and of course, Australia is a leader in a lot of that work, to say, well, that makes sense for us too, we're going to do it. And it's, at the end of the day, it's what makes sense and works.
And Jack, a lot of that common sense was created in the 1950s in the US.
Yeah, which I think we've mostly forgotten. I think we've forgotten.
That may be true. Now that may be very true. Yes.
I mean, I think you and others in the world are more aware of that than most of us are, which is not a good thing. I mean, it's a good thing for you. We need to catch up with ourselves.
So, Sally, please.
Sorry, what was I going to? No, I was actually, when we were ready, I thought we should, in fact, ask Peter to expand on adaptability for Ian. Ian made the comment that adaptability sounds like an important component of change management, whereas actually it's more than change management. But
well, away you go, Sally. Away you go.
No.
No, you do it. You do it. You can do it. Do it.
No, I handballed it.
Oh well. Adaptability, yes. Adaptability is, I've already mentioned it in terms of some aspects of it, being able to sense and respond, sense many organizations, in fact, I believe ISO 55000, I made the comment before about some of the mistakes I made, if I can use that phrase, in putting ISO 55000 together. One of them was thinking about ISO 55000 as a closed box, essentially, so that once you understand the stakeholders' requirements, you can set and forget and get on with it, and the world is not like that at all, as we know, but it's a cute engineering phenomena that you can put a box around something and then set and forget. And the Japanese experience at Fukushima, I called it, has seared their perspective on this closed box. And the Japanese are leading the way in terms of thinking about open systems, open management systems, and how do you create and maintain a management system that is indeed open. And the notion of adaptability actually builds on that notion, if not partial, whatever. Anyway, builds on that notion that in order for an organization to remain open, it has to continually think about what's around it, and continually look at what are the changes happening around it? What are the things that we weren't aware of before that we should be aware of now? Those kind of things that we've mentioned before. So adaptability is all of that, which means to me that, picking up on Sally's comment before, it's a bit more than just change management. This is really a kind of a philosophical perspective, but it has to be made real. A philosophical perspective that says we can never stand still. We always need to have someone, I call them meerkats, someone who's standing there looking up, popping up every now and again, saying, has the world changed? Have the values of the world changed? No, yes, no. If they have changed, what are we going to do about it? And this leads into conversations like risk. Most people use the word risk to mean a threat. Well, risk, when you look at the definition of risk is not a threat. It is just uncertainty associated with objectives, achievement of objectives. So the definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And so what it means is that when we talk about risk management, we should also have our people with our meerkats looking and thinking, what are the opportunities coming along, and how can we improve and improve the benefit from that opportunity, improve the probability that occurs. So adaptability is, without getting into too much detail, further detail than I've probably given, a bit more than change management. You want to add something to that? I'm sure, Sally. Yeah, what have I missed?
Oh, no, I thought that was good. I knew you'd give a good overview. The only comment I'd make is the meerkats, in fact, in an organisation that does adaptability well, will be all through the organisation.
Yes, quite true.
Which gets us back to...
And when we talk about diversity and other things, you have to have quite a few different perspectives and viewpoints. The meerkats have to have that. The lenses they look through have to once again be white light, not green or blue. So you need a whole bunch of interesting people to give you the perspective of what is the reality around us.
Which gets to the point that you made earlier, Peter, which is all of these pieces have to fit together. And so you have to have leadership and culture that supports the meerkats, that supports a streaming view of reality as opposed to a freeze frame view of reality, which is all too typical of many organizations. And coming from the federal government of the United States, I can tell you that at least when I was still there, it was all about having a strategic plan that was based on a particular snapshot in time, and then setting out, communicating the objectives that were, many of which were to be met on a quarterly basis, out to the organizations that had to achieve those objectives, and then collecting the quarterly reports back, which is just another freeze frame snapshot of what happened at that point in time. And the idea of changing that perspective to something that's more of a streaming perspective and not a freeze frame perspective is a huge cultural shift for many organizations. And I would be surprised, I would be delighted, but I would be surprised if many of my former colleagues in the US government had adopted that different perspective, that streaming perspective, which I consider core to adaptability, and not just the freeze frame perspective, which is the closed system perspective that you mentioned.
And as part of that too, Jack, we also need then the right assurance, so the right people, the right decision making, the right training through the organization to enable all of that.
Yep.
I'd also, can I be a little bit controversial again, Jack?
I hope you will.
But
I'd be disappointed.
both you and Mike talked about Apple as a successful organization. Is that true? Because again, that's the lens you apply. I would ask questions like, is it good to have a person so wealthy in the world?
Well,
So that's not judging the organization. That's from outside. The organization itself would say that its goals were to have Apple products in as many homes as possible. So they're achieving their goals. But now you're talking as a world citizen, and that's a different set of perspectives.
and it's kind of a
Well, I
government.
think it's part of the perspective of what's successful. I think that's my point, not more to
Well,
the point.
so
Yeah,
I come back to the
whether I believe it or not. Yeah.
Well, I come back to the point that at the end of the day, or at least when we talk in the ISO world, particularly the ISO 55000 world, we're talking from the perspective of an organization. And so from an organizational perspective, from Apple's perspective, looking at Apple as an organization among a lot of different organizations, they've been pretty successful. Now, if you back away from that and look at it from a government perspective or a societal perspective, that's a whole other conversation. And one can absolutely reasonably ask, is the concentration of wealth in a small number of people a good thing for the country? Is it a good thing for civilization? I mean, that's a kind of an interesting conversation. It's not a conversation that except for the occasional revolution, that we have a whole lot of effect on. But it's a worthwhile conversation to have, and it's clear. Although personally, I believe that sort of concentration of wealth is a bad thing for society. I mean, even though I feel that personally, I have absolutely no ability, except from occasionally casting a vote for somebody who might also not like that idea, to do anything about it. So
it's not just Apple, it's Facebook, it's Microsoft, it's the tech robber barons. Instead of being steel and railroad, it's now technology. And it's up to the government, which is the larger subset of organization, to be able to look at that question.
And we're all our own government. Someone's asked a question on the slides. If I can change topics completely. And Peter, you might like to start off with this one. Because it's about leadership and culture. And the person's asking to please say more in the context of value about leadership and culture.
In the context of value, leadership and culture.
Well, it'd be about the delivery of value, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's about the delivery of value. Yeah.
I can step in on that while Peter grabs his thoughts, because I am so happy to be involved in the asset leadership network, not the asset management network. Asset management is critical and important, but what we need now to help the world address the world of problems we're facing is leadership. And leadership sets the tone for the culture to achieve objectives, measurable results, some of which can be dollars, but I'm happy that there are now the 6 capitals, the triple bottom line, ways of looking at success that is more than just dollar amounts. And it's very important to have leaders that follow that approach.
One of the things that Sally and I have talked about, and a couple of others have talked about quite a while now, is the notion of leadership and culture, and what does that mean in an organizational sense, and how would that relate to I guess success in the application of the discipline of asset management, and indeed success in the business context as well, success as a business as well. And one of the questions we ask often ask is, often say is, things like, should the leadership style of the organization just evolve, or should the leadership style of an organization be designed? In other words, should it happen by accident or should it happen by design? Should the asset management culture of an organization happen by accident or should it happen by design? And a number of us, believe it should happen by design, not by accident. And there are many illustrations of this around the world, where the leadership style of an organization is actually by design. Most of the time, it's by accident. But if you want to be successful as a business, as an organization, particularly from an asset management perspective, then these are some interesting issues to think about. And Sally and I have been involved in some activities to address that question in a bit more detail. Do you want to add to that, Sally? Yeah.
I think you and Mike have covered it broadly. The only comment perhaps I'll make is that we talk about the 5 fundamentals, which are alignment, value, leadership and culture, assurance, and adaptability. And all of these fundamentals or principles, whichever you want to call them, are vital to apply to obtain and sustain the maximum value that you deliver with asset management. And of all of them, leadership and culture is the least understood and most ignored. And it's one of the big problems.
For example, it may be something for everyone here to think about. I don't know how they view life, but one of the things that I've learned over the years is you can design systems to work really well, and a lot of people, you have people interfacing with the systems. Machines occasionally break down, so do people. But if you don't design a management system to deal with both people breaking down and machines breaking down, then you do have a problem. And often that's called human error. If you're in a high risk, high cost industry as in aviation, how would you deal with human error? Well, that industry has learned very well, generally speaking, to deal with the subject of human error. So it leads you into some interesting, these discussions lead you into some interesting areas. But when you talk about leadership and culture, one of the great determinants of the notion of human error, in other words, what's the probability someone will do something wrong, is what's in their heads, what is their mindset. So what is the culture they work in? What are their values and beliefs, and how can you, if you need to, change those? Not in the way that you're changing people's minds or mind washing, but instill in them the values that you need as a business and as a society we need to be successful.
So one of the things I think it's important to keep in mind is that, again, we're talking about organizations, and a lot of organizations have not been successful. They no longer exist, and they don't exist because they didn't get it right. They didn't design the right organizational structure. They didn't care about it. They thought they had all the answers, and they were wrong. And so one of the things that I find value in when I look at the ISO standards is that what ISO tried to do, and I think has done a pretty good job of, is pull together ideas that have been characteristic of successful organizations. And these are principles that people have learned over the years that have been, if you exhibit these characteristics, you're more likely to be successful than if you don't. But at the end of the day, it's up to organizations to decide if they want to take advantage of the lessons others have learned and design an organizational structure based on those lessons, or they're just going to wing it. And some of the ones that wing it may end up being successful for reasons that we're still trying to figure out. But a lot of them that are successful because they've done these proven things that other people have tested out and found useful, and they have found them useful too. So we need to keep that in mind when we talk about, when we talk about organizations and we talk about value, is that you know, at the end of the day, it's what an organization decides and whether or not they've decided on a path that is going to be successful, and being able to measure. That brings me back to a point I tried to make earlier, and I don't think I made it well, is that whatever your sense of value is, and presumably that sense of value is informed by your stakeholders, particularly the ones that clearly matter the most to your success. You know, you create operational plans that are designed to achieve that value. And then at the end of the day, you have to measure whether or not you got where you wanted to go. And if you haven't, you have to figure out why you didn't, and you need to make the necessary corrections to do better next time. So that's one of the, to me, one of the most beautiful things about the ISO standard is, like, if you don't get it right the first time, understand where you didn't get it right, make the changes, and do better next time. I mean, that to me is one of the most powerful aspects of what we're talking about in asset management.
And the point Sally and I were trying to make before is that will never happen in an organization unless everyone in the organization buys into the notion that things do change, and we wish things to change from time to time. Because a lot of people in an organization, when you hear the word change, everyone dives under the desk and puts their hands above their head and says, "Not for me." Organizations that are very good at continual improvement, the people there have the idea that change is good, not change is bad.
The word continuous improvement, they don't use the word change.
Yeah, but that's what it means, though. Continuous improvement means change, though.
Yeah, but humans, being what they are, don't use the word change. Use improvement.
But you know, the thing is, when people talk about change management, you know, a lot of people think change management, that's this mysterious thing. It's really not mysterious. Change management is getting everybody involved in everybody who's impacted by the change involved in figuring out what that change is. It's just that simple. I mean, it may be hard to execute in practice, but conceptually, it's just that simple. You know,
ISO 55001 4.2 involve all relevant stakeholders.
I would say one thing to add to what you say, Jack. That the whole bunch of people have written lots of books about this, and traditionally people use Kohler's 8-step change process. But one thing I would add to that, what you just said, is it's one thing for you as the senior person in an organization to advocate change, because you can see the benefit from it, and you will see the organizational benefit. Everyone else in the business has got to buy into that, so they have to see what's in it for them. Right. That's the important part of all that. They have to see what's in it for them.
Absolutely.
Well, that's a leadership and culture behavior.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you,
Sally.
Yeah, thank you, Sally and Peter. I didn't give you a big introduction, but you were involved in starting the Asset Management Council in Australia, so you've been at this for a long time, and it's really quite honor and a pleasure for the ALN to have you so involved in some of our programs. And Jack Kelly, fascinating mind. It's always great to talk with you. And Nick, if you can share the slide about our program that's coming up in just 2 weeks. This one is focused on energy. So we've got the head of engineering for Energy Australia and the acting asset manager for Bonneville Power Administration, which is in the Western US. And they operate 34 dams and the electricity that's generated from them. So we're looking forward to that. And thank you all for attending and questions. And again, thank you, Peter, Sally, and Jack. And this is just so that we meet our legal obligations. We've been referencing some of these books and papers that Peter and Sally were mentioning.